In a universe where humanity is often underestimated, there exists a truth that the most powerful alien races fear to admit. We are practically impossible to kill. Not because of advanced technology, not because of superior weapons, but because of something far more fundamental, our incredible ability to adapt. And today, I will share with you a story that made the mighty Ingvarian Empire discover this in the worst possible way. Imagine the scene. An ordinary human prisoner, bound in an interrogation room aboard an alien warship. 3 blaster shots pierce his chest, energy sufficient to vaporize vital organs. Any normal living being would be dead instantly. But what happens? The human simply laughs, looks at his wounds closing and asks, "Again?" This is not just another science fiction story. It is a testament to the true power of humanity. While other species rely on advanced alien technology and impossible weapons, we have evolved to become the ultimate weapon ourselves. A bioweapon that our enemies tried to use against us 500 years ago, which ended up becoming our greatest evolutionary advantage. What would you do if you discovered that every attempt to destroy us only makes us stronger? How would you react? Upon realizing that death is not the end, but merely the beginning of something far more terrifying. This is the story that shook the foundations of the most powerful empire in the galaxy and proved that when it comes to survival, humanity knows no limits. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of cosmic horror, where the line between life and death becomes blurred, and where the true nature of human resilience reveals itself in its most frightening form. This is the story that made the Ingvarians learn a harsh lesson. Never ever underestimate a human. The silence in the interrogation room of the Cutting Wind was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of containment fields and the occasional dripping of blood onto the metallic floor. Seeker Truck observed his prisoner with a mixture of fascination and growing discomfort. In his 300 cycles serving the Ingvarian Empire, he had never encountered a creature like this. The human before him, identified simply as Jim, should have been dead, not smiling with blood-stained teeth, while 3 smoldering holes decorated his torso. The room's biometric sensors registered the impossible. The prisoner's vital signs fluctuated between death and life, like a macabre dance defying all known logic. Truck adjusted his upper mandibles, a nervous tic he had not manifested in a long time. The alien technology of the precursors, which he so eagerly sought to extract from prisoners, seemed insignificant in the face of the enigma he now faced. The veteran interrogator was beginning to question whether he had made a fundamental mistake by bringing this creature aboard. The air in the room grew heavier, laden with a metallic scent that came not just from the blood. It was something more primal, more ancient. A smell that made the dorsal scales on Truck's back rise in an instinctive alert his species had not experienced since their evolutionary days on their homeworld. Survival, he realized, was no longer a matter of strength or intelligence, but of quickly understanding that the rules of the game had changed drastically. Again? Jim's voice cut through the silence like a poisoned blade, his almost playful tone grotesquely contrasting with the exposed flesh on his chest. The human prisoner flexed his muscles against his restraints, not in an attempt to escape, but as if testing his own strength, like a predator evaluating the perfect moment to strike. The intergalactic war had taught the Ingvarians much about domination, but nothing had prepared them for this. The guards in the room, warriors chosen from the best of the Imperial Army, unconsciously took a step back. Their weapons, state-of-the-art blasters, capable of reducing heavy armor to vapor, suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate in the face of the prisoner's ever-widening smile. Fear, an emotion considered extinct among the Ingvarians for generations, began to seep into the room like an invisible toxic gas. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. With each shot that should have been fatal, with each wound that should have ended his existence, Jim seemed to grow stronger, more present, more something Truk could not define. The interrogator realized he was witnessing not just a phenomenon of resilience or immortality, but something far more disturbing. Accelerated evolution happening before his eyes. The fate of the ship, he was beginning to suspect, had already been sealed the moment they allowed this creature aboard. On the monitoring screen, data continued to flow in an impossible stream. Cellular regeneration at rates never before recorded, neural activity in patterns that defied comprehension, and something more. A unique energy signature eerily reminiscent of the forbidden artifacts of the precursors. But there was a crucial difference. While ancient alien technology always maintained a recognizable pattern, what flowed through Jim's body was chaotic, adaptive, alive. Human resilience, Truck was beginning to understand, was not merely a matter of willpower. It was something much more fundamental, something coded into the very essence of their species. Aboard the Cutting Wind, the pride of the Seeker's elite fleet, the interrogation protocol was a well-rehearsed dance. Like a symphony of suffering, each movement was calibrated to extract information with surgical precision. Truck had perfected this art over decades, turning fear and pain into tools as precise as any alien technology. But the human prisoner named Jim was rewriting all the rules of this dark game. The first blaster shot struck Jim in the left shoulder, a wound that should have instantly incapacitated any being of flesh and blood. The muscle tissue vaporized, leaving behind a smoking hole that exuded a pungent stench of burnt flesh. Instead of the expected screams, there was only a bored sigh, as if the prisoner were watching a particularly dull performance. The room's sensors registered massive cellular death, but also something more, a regeneration process that defied all known laws of biology. The second shot tore through the human's chest, a blow that any war manual would classify as absolutely, fatal. Jim's heart was literally vaporized, along with a considerable portion of his left lung. The monitors blared in alarm, registering total failure of vital organs. But the prisoner's eyes remained focused, conscious, almost amused. "You know," he commented casually, while new tissue sprouted from the edges of the wound like a grotesque flower. "You guys really need to upgrade your arsenal." The third plasma energy discharge struck Jim directly in the face, a show of force that should have definitively ended any possibility of survival. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the interrogation room. Then, to the horror of those present, laughter began to echo, a laughter emerging from a partially reconstructed throat, emanating from a skull regenerating before their eyes. The contagion of fear began to spread among the guards like an invisible virus. Truck watched, both fascinated and horrified, as his prisoner demonstrated a capacity for survival beyond anything recorded in the vast archives of the Ingvarian Empire. Each wound not only healed, but seemed to make Jim stronger, as if the very attempt to destroy him was, in some perverse way, feeding him. The bioweapon he represented was not a technology. It was a force of nature, an expression of evolution, that redefined the very concept of life and death. The guards in the room, veterans of countless space battles, began exchanging glances that revealed an emotion long forgotten by their species: doubt. Their weapons, capable of piercing the hull of a warship, proved insignificant against this single human prisoner. Humanity's power did not lie in its technology or brute strength, but in something far more fundamental: an adaptability that turned every attempt at extermination into an opportunity for rebirth. As Jim continued his impossible demonstration of immortality, something began to shift in the room's atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with an ancient energy that caused the monitoring systems to flicker erratically. The forgotten legacies of the precursors, which Truk had sought for so long, seemed to echo through time, as if recognizing something in this human that transcended their own alien technology. The true nature of the nightmare they had brought aboard was only beginning to reveal itself. Decades of experience as a seeker had taught Truk to recognize the subtle signs of fear across hundreds of different species. It was a universal language that transcended biological barriers: the dilation of pupils, the increase in respiratory rate, the micro-muscle contractions that preceded panic. But now, for the first time in his career, he realized that these signs were not emanating from the prisoner, but from the very guards of the Cutting Wind. The horror had changed direction, like a weapon turned against its own wielder. With each new execution attempt, Jim displayed not just supernatural resistance, but a visible evolution in his abilities. Wounds that initially took seconds to heal now closed almost instantly. His living flesh pulsed with its own energy, as if every cell in his body had transformed into a micro-factory of survival. The human prisoner was not merely surviving, he was adapting, improving, transcending the very limits of known biology. The interrogation room's monitoring systems registered impossible alterations in the prisoner's molecular structure. It was as if his DNA was being rewritten in real time, incorporating each trauma as a new lesson in immortality. The alien. Technology of the precursors, which had so fascinated the Ingvarian Empire, seemed primitive in comparison to this demonstration of biological adaptability. Jim did not need energy shields or cybernetic implants. His own body had become a living fortress in constant evolution. The sound of weapons firing had ceased, replaced by a dense, oppressive silence. The guards, warriors chosen from the elite of the Imperial Army, kept their blasters aimed at Jim, but their fingers trembled over the triggers. Fear was no longer a tool of interrogation. It had become a physical presence in the room, a force emanating from the prisoner like a toxic aura. The reversal of roles was complete. The torturers had become the prey. Jim's transformation extended beyond the physical. His eyes, initially dulled by pain, now gleamed with a predatory intensity that made the scales of the Ingvarians bristle in instinctive alarm. Every movement he made, no matter how small, carried an implicit threat of restrained violence. Extreme. Survival had become his new nature, and each failed attempt to kill him only solidified his dominance over the situation. Fate had turned the victim into some kind of superior monster, an unstoppable force that defied death itself. The room's sensors began detecting increasing anomalies, not just in Jim, but in the very environment around him. It was as if his presence was distorting the fabric of reality, creating a field of influence that affected everything in his vicinity. The air felt denser, charged with microscopic particles dancing in impossible patterns. The corruption of his cells had transcended the limits of his body, turning into something broader, more insidious, a contamination spreading like an invisible wave of nightmare. In Truk's mind, a terrible realization began to take shape. The interrogation protocol, so carefully planned, had become a catalyst for something far beyond his control. Every act of violence against Jim not only failed to break him, it served as fuel for a deeper, more fundamental transformation. The intergalactic war had taught the Ingvarians that human resilience was remarkable. But this was something entirely different. It was evolution in its purest and most terrifying form, unfolding before his eyes in real time. In a frantic search for answers, Truk had summoned Felby, an alien archaeologist held in the adjacent cells. The prisoner, a frail-looking creature with multiple sensory appendages, visibly trembled in Jim's presence. It was not the common fear of captives. There was something deeper in his terror, an ancestral recognition of something that should have remained buried in the depths of galactic history. His sensory tentacles writhed in patterns, indicating extreme agitation as he began to reveal a disturbing truth about the nature of the variants. The story Felby shared was a forgotten nightmare, a dark chapter of galactic evolution that the Ingvarian Empire had never suspected. 5 centuries earlier, an ancient civilization known as the Uman had reached the pinnacle of its technological development. In their arrogance, they created the ultimate bioweapon, a virus that transformed living organisms into self-regenerating war machines. It was the perfect synthesis of alien technology and genetic engineering, designed to create soldiers impossible to kill, warriors who transcended the boundaries between life and death. The Uman's plan was brutally simple: use humanity as a testing ground for their creation. They considered humans an inferior species, suitable only as test subjects for their ultimate war experiment. The virus was released on ancient Earth, designed to turn the human population into undead monsters, a force of extermination that could be controlled and directed against the Uman's enemies. But something happened that none of the architects of this weapon could have foreseen. Humanity did not succumb. Instead, a transformation began that would forever change the balance of power in the galaxy. Human resistance proved to be more than mere biological stubbornness. It was a fundamental trait encoded in their DNA, a capacity for adaptation that turned the very bioweapon into an evolutionary advantage. Humans did not merely survive the virus, they mastered it, perfected it, transformed it into something new. The immortality that was meant to be their curse became their greatest gift. Every human who died had the potential to awaken as a variant, an evolution of the species that transcended the limitations of flesh and bone. As Felby continued his revelation, the interrogation room's sensors recorded alarming changes in Jim's biological signature. The virus in his system was no longer a simple infection. It was a symphony of controlled mutation, a microscopic dance of destruction and rebirth that defied all scientific logic. The variants were not just survivors, they were the next step in human evolution, beings who had turned a weapon of extermination into a path to transcendence. The horror of the situation began to crystallize in Troke's mind. Every attempt to kill Jim not only failed, it served as a catalyst for an even deeper transformation. The ship's command had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for the awakening of a variant, turning a mere prisoner into something far beyond their understanding. The precursor technology they had sought so desperately now seemed insignificant compared to this display of biological adaptability that defied death itself. The implications of this revelation were devastating, not just for the current mission, but for the entire concept of intergalactic warfare within the Ingvarian Empire. How do you fight an enemy that turns every defeat into victory, every death into rebirth? The forgotten legacies of the Uman had returned to haunt the galaxy, not as a force of destruction, but as a testament to the unyielding power of human evolution. The relentless force that Jim represented was merely the tip of an evolutionary iceberg that threatened to submerge the entire known power structure. The moment Jim broke his shackles resonated through the interrogation room like an omen of imminent destruction. The reinforced metal, designed to contain the strongest known species in the galaxy, crumbled like paper in his hands. His laughter, which once seemed like an act of defiance, now carried a dark promise of vengeance. The guards, seasoned warriors of the Ingvarian Empire, barely had time to raise their blasters before the true horror began to unfold before their eyes. Jim's movement defied all known laws of physics. His speed was not just superhuman. It was something entirely new, as if he had developed his own interpretation of the laws of motion. The alien security technology of the ship registered his displacements as blurs, impossible to track. Within seconds, 3 guards lay on the ground, their bodies still warm but already beginning to exhibit disturbing signs of transformation. The virus was not merely killing, it was recruiting. The scene that followed defied any attempt at rational description. Jim was not merely attacking, he was feeding, consuming not just flesh and blood, but something more fundamental, as if he were absorbing the very life essence of his victims. Every body that fell under his hands became part of a greater process, a transformation that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The corpses of the guards, still fresh on the metallic floor, began to convulse with unnatural spasms, their cells already responding to the call of mutation. Survival was no longer a matter of strength or strategy. It had become a desperate race against a contagion that was spreading exponentially. The ship's monitoring systems recorded cascading biological alterations, a wave of transformation propagating through the corridors like a living nightmare. Each new victim was not merely a casualty. They became a new vector of infection, a new soldier in an army of monsters that grew with each passing minute. The screams echoing through the corridors of the cutting wind were not just expressions of terror. They were the sound of reality itself shattering. Human resilience had manifested in its most terrifying form, a demonstration of adaptability that turned death itself into a weapon. The creatures that now rose were not mindless zombies. They retained a terrifying intelligence, guided by a primal instinct for expansion and conquest that made intergalactic war seem like a child's game. Truk watched, paralyzed by a primal fear, as his warship transformed into a biomechanical horror. The creatures that had once been his soldiers now moved with a disturbing coordination, as if they were part of a greater collective consciousness. The virus was not merely transforming bodies, it was creating a new form of life, an unstoppable force that combined the best of human evolution with the most terrifying aspects of precursor technology. The emergency lights flickered blood-red along the corridors, casting dancing shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The sound of the ventilation systems now carried a miasma of death and rebirth, microscopic particles of transformation, that promised to spread this nightmare beyond the confines of the ship. The revolution Jim had begun was not merely an escape, it was the beginning of something much greater, a fundamental shift in the balance of power that had governed the galaxy for millennia. The chaos that engulfed the cutting wind transcended any existing emergency protocol in the Ingvarian Empire's manuals. The alarms blared in a discordant symphony of panic, their strobing lights turning the corridors into a blood-red kaleidoscope of horror. The ship's captain, a veteran of countless space battles, found himself facing a situation that no training could have prepared him for. His orders, transmitted through the communication system with a forced calm, were systematically ignored by a crew in complete terror. The alien technology that made the Cutting Wind one of the most advanced ships in the fleet proved tragically inadequate against the biological threat spreading through its compartments. The internal sensors, calibrated to detect any known form of life or death, were overloading from the impossible readings they received. It was not just life or death propagating through the corridors. It was something in between, a transformation that defied all known scientific logic. Survival now depended not on strength or strategy, but on how fast one could run. The corridors, once impeccably organized according to Ingvarian military efficiency, had turned into a nightmare labyrinth. Every corner could hide a new horror. Every compartment could harbor another manifestation of the revolt Jim had initiated. The monsters that were once crew members moved with an unsettling coordination, as if they were part of a greater collective consciousness. The immortality they now possessed was not merely a matter of physical regeneration. It was a fundamental transformation that connected them to something greater and far more terrifying. Attempts at containment proved not only useless, but actively counterproductive. Every soldier who fell while trying to contain the threat became a new recruit for the exponentially growing army of the undead. Human resistance, manifesting through this evolving bioweapon, demonstrated an adaptive capacity that rendered any conventional combat strategy obsolete. The blasters, which once symbolized the supreme power of the Empire, now seemed like children's toys before the relentless force they had awakened. The ship's intercommunication system, designed to transmit orders with crystal-clear clarity even amidst the chaos of space battles, now carried something far more disturbing: the sound of transformation in progress. Screams of terror gradually morphed into something different, a rising chorus of voices that were no longer entirely human, nor alien, but something new and dreadful. And then, cutting through this chorus like a sharp blade, came Jim's voice, clear, controlled, and carrying a predatory satisfaction that made the scales of every survivor bristle with primordial terror. The intergalactic war had taught the Ingvarians many lessons about power and domination, but nothing had prepared them for this. The forgotten legacies of the precursors, which they had so desperately sought to understand and control, seemed insignificant in the face of this display of accelerated evolution. The virus was not merely transforming individuals, it was rewriting the very rules of life and death, creating a new form of existence that threatened to upend the entire established order of the galaxy. In the command center, the last surviving, officers watched helplessly as the ship's systems gradually fell under Jim's control. The screens displayed a living map of the horror spreading, each red dot representing another area lost to the creatures. The rebirth they were witnessing was not merely a matter of bodies returning to life. It was the birth of something entirely new, a force that combined the tenacity of humanity with a power beyond the Ingvarians' comprehension. The last resistance of the Cutting Wind was concentrated in the command room, where Truk met his inevitable fate. The Seeker, once a master in the art of terror, now found himself surrounded by the last surviving prisoners and their unlikely leader. Jim, covered, in blood that was not entirely his own, emanated an aura of power that made reality itself seem distorted around him. The transformation he had undergone went beyond the physical. It was as if he had become a living conduit for something far older and more terrifying than any known alien technology. The ship's systems were still operational, but now they answered to a new master. The holographic screens displayed the map of destruction that had spread through the corridors, each pulsating point representing another area claimed by the relentless force Jim had unleashed. Extreme survival had turned into a macabre art form, where every attempt at resistance only strengthened the army of undead now patrolling the halls. The horror of the situation was amplified by the near-military efficiency with which the creatures moved, a coordination that suggested a collective intelligence guiding their actions. The irony of the situation did not escape Truck. The interrogator had become the interrogated. Jim moved through the command center with a predatory grace that defied his seemingly monstrous nature. Every step he took was calculated. Every gesture carried the weight of 5 centuries of forced evolution. The virus running through his veins was no longer a mere bioweapon. It had transformed into something symbiotic, a perfect fusion between human adaptability and the destructive power that the Uman had tried to create. The intergalactic war had taught many lessons about power, but nothing compared to this. The fear Truck felt now was unlike anything he had ever experienced or inflicted upon others. It was not the simple terror of death. It was the horror of the unknown, of the incomprehensible. Any attempt at bargaining died in his throat as he watched Jim approach. The human's smile carried a promise far more terrifying than death. The possibility of joining his nightmare legion, of becoming part of something that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The corruption he had witnessed was not just physical, it was a fundamental transformation of the very nature of existence. The final revelation came as a whisper, carrying the weight of a death sentence. Jim's mission had never been simply to escape. The prisoners surrounding him were not mere victims of circumstance. They were part of a greater plan, pieces in a game that had begun centuries ago. The search for the lost artifacts of the precursors was not just about alien technology. It was a race against time to find something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. Human resistance had evolved far beyond mere survival. The fate-awaiting Truk was a perfect reflection of the cruelty he had practiced for so long. The immortality Jim offered was not a gift. It was a curse disguised as a blessing, a transformation that would preserve his consciousness while destroying everything that defined him as a being. The rebirth he had witnessed was not merely a matter of bodies returning to life. It was the birth of a new form of existence, one that threatened to overturn the entire established order of the cosmos. The final moments in the command room were marked by a cruel clarity. The monitors continued to display the unstoppable advance of the creatures through the lower levels of the ship, each new point of contagion representing another victory for the relentless force Jim commanded. The revolution he had begun was not just about survival. It was a demonstration of power that would make the Ingvarian Empire reconsider everything they believed they knew about the nature of life, death, and humanity itself. A single human, Prisoner had turned one of the most powerful Ingvarian warships into his own nightmare playground. But is this truly the end? What happened to the search for the lost artifacts Jim mentioned? And what darker secrets does humanity still hide in its modified DNA? If you were as fascinated as I was by this demonstration of humanity's true power, you need to check out our next story. They laughed when I said humans can breathe poison. The evolution that shocked the galaxy. We will discover how an entire colony of human miners survived a chemical attack that should have wiped out all life in seconds. The true nature of human survival is far more astonishing than any alien race could imagine. And we have hundreds of stories like this to share with you. Stories that prove, time and again, why humanity is the most feared and respected species in the galaxy. Don't miss any of these incredible revelations. Activate the notification bell right now and join our community of human power enthusiasts. And tell me in the comments, what part of this story surprised you the most? Jim's impossible regeneration, or the way he turned his own torturers into a nightmare army? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment. We have many more stories of resilience, extreme survival, and human domination to share with you. Because in the end, in a universe full of advanced alien technology, the greatest weapon has always been and always will be humanity itself.